us a little bit more about your mother. What kind of made her her? Because I think when we know what made your mother, it helps us understand where you come from too. You know.
All right. Well, somehow my mother was a genius. So she just was. She started school and they just skipped her ahead of grade. What the heck? Because she was bored with the old stuff. And she graduated then from high school at 16. That's a little young, but not for her. And then she went to Idaho State for a couple of years, and then down to BYU in Provo, and got her first degree, her bachelor's degree, and then and teaching certificate. She went to Morgan and taught for a year there, and then went back to BYU and got her master's degree. And then she also got an MRS degree and married my father, and that was it. She didn't teach again until all of us were deep in grade school. There was nobody left at home, and hadn't been well, Susan was in the third grade when Mother went back to teaching elementary ed, and it was great. And she was just incredibly brilliant. She did student teaching for the people at the university. They'd come use her to teach with. And then the university came to her. This is when it turned into a university, and they said, we'd like to have a campus school for our College of Education, and we'd like you to direct it and establish it and set it up. So she built that by teaching the first grade, and then the next year they had a first grade and a second grade, and then the next year they had a first grade, a second grade, and a third grade. But she was always teaching and training, and it was really fun. And then she went back to Utah State University in Logan and got her doctor's degree and Doctor of Education. And she was just brilliant. She was like the number one student at BYU. She and the valedictorian had the same grade point average, but he was a boy, and so it's understood. You have to remember, these is in the 30s. It was understood, of course, he'd be the valedictorian and she'd be the salutatorian. And that just, as she grew up, one of the things did rankle her a little, because when she was getting her, in the 30s, when she was still going to school and getting her master's degree, they would have some classes where the professor would say, we have some discussion. We don't know that if a female's mind is capable of catching and holding the information that we put out here. This is, it's kind of new ground, and we don't really know. Take the right up. Of course, I don't know, but there was a little tug in cheek because she was a very cute girl. Mm-hmm. But, that could be part of it. But it was one of those things that always got her going a little. So it's kind of fun.
Yeah, so I've heard a couple of stories about her, and I wanted to run these two by you because they're pretty impressive, and I was curious if they were true, and if they were, maybe you could expound on them. So the first one is she was, there was like the question of whether or not women should get higher levels of degrees, like maybe doctorates. And so she took the side in the class of women shouldn't, and then everybody else had to take that they should. Is that true?
Yeah, she was.
So tell us a little bit about that. Tell us the background and everything.
Well, let me explain how these things work. My mother was a people person. She understood people tremendously. And she was a fantastic teacher, and she was a tremendous debater. She was in debate in high school and winning like crazy. And you have to remember, she was all of 16 when she graduated. Uh-huh. But she had tremendous ability. So politically, she had lots of savvy and lots of people that she knew. And it did rankle her. She would mention to us that the last minority to get the vote were the women. Mm-hmm. She said the slave men got the vote right away, and it would be another 50 years plus before they gave it to their wives. Is that interesting? And she had some comments on that, but I married a girl who also had comments just like that, so I understood. But anyway, that was just one, but that's the way to do it. Then your opposition has to learn your part of it, right?
Right.
If you have someone debating and they have to make, and they're getting graded on their debate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they have to be able to prove that women had every possible capacity for advanced degrees. It was the best idea in the world to grant them as hard as they can. Obviously, hers won because we have more girls than boys getting advanced degrees in the United States of America today. More doctors, more attorneys, more just master's degrees and doctor's degrees than men, and also bachelor's. There's more a higher education among women than among men in the year 2020.
That's amazing. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that is where it's at, and it's been very carefully laid for many years. The mindset has been worked on. You do not see on TV ever where the father is the confident, capable, savvy, got it together, fountain of all knowledge that everybody goes to, and the mom is just kind of for fun and all that. It's the opposite, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's by design, and it's been done, and I know one of the designers. So they push women to the front. They give them greater opportunities, and the sheer numbers carry it. More girls graduate from college every year than boys, and that includes law and medicine and anything else that pays very well.
It's kind of cool that your mother was at the forefront of that. That's pretty awesome.
She was, yeah. She was one of those. She was a lady suffragette. They already had the vote when she was a little girl. They didn't when she was born. Of course, they didn't. But later on, when she was just a tiny girl, then the women got the vote, and then they actually started voting some women into government. I remember being there in Boise with Mother when she was introducing me to the power women in the state legislature for the state of Idaho, because she knew them all personally. Just neat,
Yeah, and I can tell. Yeah, I can tell that your mother played a huge part in you growing up. Of course, from past stories that I've heard, but from what you're saying now. And so, kind of like going into that. So now that I have an idea of where your mother was and who she was, what was it like having her as a mother? What kind of mother was she? What are some fond memories that you have of that kind of relationship in Pocatello?
She was the warmest, most loving, kindest person I ever knew. She was just totally kind and totally loving. She was always supportive. She was tremendous. I count sometimes that I have unique value because Heavenly Father sent me to June Martineau to be my mother, and that was just fantastic. She had every possible virtue she had in scores. She was just the virtuous woman. Just fantastic, very sophisticated, very smart, very with it, very cool lady,
mm-hmm.
and very accomplished. And being her son, it all rubbed off on me. She took care of me. She introduced me. She taught me. We did a lot of conversing and visiting and talking together. So she was a tremendous influence in my life, and she had a very solid testimony, and all the things that make people positive and good she had, and she was a great teacher, and she taught us. So how's that for a piece?
I love that. So is there like a specific memory that you have or a story that you feel like really encompasses her as a mother to you?
Oh my goodness, it's an interesting thing that I haven't had that exact question before. I'm just thinking that there's all the times in my life when there was either really stress coming at us, or we had great joy, or we needed encouragement. She was always there just encouraging us. And there are so many of them. That's the thing. In every possible way, she was encouraging. She always made us feel like we could take on anything that came, that we could be supportive, that the Lord was always there. The last thing at night, when I would go down to take care of my grandmother, she'd say, and remember to say your prayers. And I said, why do you always say that? And she would reply, so someday when I'm far away, you'll remember and say them. And when I went on my mission, she couldn't say that last part because it was too hard. I was going to be too far away, but I most certainly was going to pray. And even now, and I'm north of 75, even now, I think back on that little exchange of words between a mother and a son, and I remember my prayers. Not that I would ever not, but it's there, isn't it? It's part of me.
Yeah.
So, and they're little positive things. I learned to teach by watching my mother teach church classes, and so that was a tremendous influence. So I've been a good teacher. I'm capable. But the reason I'm capable is because I had the greatest master teacher trainer in the world teaching me. This lady was phenomenal. When she finally ended up as Dr. Macabre in California, she was on the speaker circuit where they had the people who are the stellar stars of the California education system, and they would pay her way and pay for the hotel and everything else. And she would go give classes to teachers about teaching teachers and also teaching teachers how to teach other teachers to teach teachers. I know that sounds incredible, but it's the whole bureaucracy and hierarchy of education, not talking administration, talking instruction. And she was the best in the state of California when she died. So that's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
So the teaching.
I was going to ask about if this was true about your mother. Is it true that she could write like two different sentences with like the right hand and the left hand? Does that make sense? Like she could write.
She could write with either hand. That was kind of handy in her teaching, but she didn't write two different sentences at the same time. She would just be walking along the chalkboard and she could write and she could pass the chalk to the other hand. That sort of thing is handy. However, it has its drawbacks because she never knew just right off the bat which was left or right. You can feel it. But we'd say, take a quick right, and she'd have to feel for her wedding ring with her thumb so she'd know which hand was which.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and she would read ahead when she read us a story, and she'd be a page ahead of us and sometimes more. And she'd still be reading the words. I mean, the words would come out of her mouth just the same, but she was never back where her mouth was because it just wasn't there. But she could memorize it. She could memorize and remember everything.
Do you feel like she had a photographic memory?
Oh, she did have. Yeah, she did have a photographic memory. She could see the page again and read it.
That's pretty amazing.
But she'd speed read too. She'd take a couple of books to bed every night and read them. 2 books every night, or sometimes more. That's just,
wow.
She could read, and with real close to 100% comprehension, and I don't know, maybe, and this is not exaggerating, maybe a couple of thousand words a minute. She could just reach her eyes down the pages, and it all came in, and she didn't miss anything. And I don't know how she did, but it helped her in schooling. It helped her tremendously, and it helped her to pass tests. She took chemistry, and she was way into her chemistry year when she went to her professor and said, I discovered the most wonderful thing. And he said, what's that, Miss? He said, all these things at the end, that's what we studied before. He'd say, what? Well, she would just memorize them, all the equations just as nonsense stuff, you know. So, people who can memorize pi up to 34 figures. Well, she could memorize anything. And so she would just memorize all the chemical equations, and then she could write them down on the board and do anything. She had no idea what they were doing. She just knew if you put this bunch of letters together with that bunch of letters, it created this bunch of letters over here.
That's amazing.
Yeah. He said, I want you to promise me you'll never take another math class because someone else will figure out what's going on here. But anyway, however, she did take another math class and got her doctor's degree and got her out of her classes in statistics and calculus as well. But
there's one piece of the family that you haven't talked a lot about, and that is your father. And I know that that's a tricky situation, and so I'll let you share whatever you want to share about that. So is
Sure.
there anything that you want to share in regards to your father?
Yeah. My father was had several things growing up. He came from an immigrant background. They were immigrating from Mexico, from colonial Chihuahua into Mexico. They were American citizens already, but they got down to Mexico because of religious persecution. There's a whole group of our people went down into the colonies. They created the colonies in Mexico across the border from El Paso. And they were very successful, and they worked very hard. And they had, great big farms. My great-great-grandfather had, huge farms. And grandfather had a big farm, and we have still his record of all the stuff that he had on his farm when the Mexican rebels and whatever came and drove them out of Mexico. And so, but then they were out of Mexico, and then they were refugees, and they were poor, and things were tough, and all that kind of stuff, and that affected my father, just the way they do sometimes. He was a very hard worker, excitingly hard, just terribly hard worker. Work ethic was everything, and he had a very powerful testimony of the gospel, but he also had a temper. Well, he had, unfortunately, a short temper. And so sometimes it wasn't the best answer for things. And he was very strong. He was a tremendous athlete. He won track events and field events a lot. And then he played basketball extremely well. And he played for college ball. He played all of it. And so he was very strong. He did his church work very faithfully. He always fulfilled every assignment. And he was a great missionary and did his best to help people to come to the church, and did a beautiful job there. And 99% of the time, he was really great.
Oh, good.
And 1% of the time, he lost it a little.
I know that you had a pretty strong relationship with your grandparents, particularly your grandmother, right? She lived just down the road?
Yeah, I did.
So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, for the time when I grew up, when I was born, I lived at 455 South Johnson, and she lived at 406 South Johnson. And that's a Seattle block. It's, maybe 200 yards away. And so every day I'd get up, I can still remember doing it. And I was 3 and 4. My mother would give me a piece of fruit or something to take up to grandmother. And I'd go up, and grandmother would listen to my childish prattle for hours. And I provided it. And she did all kinds of things with me. And later on, we moved when I was 5, which isn't too very much later on. And then we would come down. Grandmother was living alone because grandfather died when I was 1. And it was lonely at night, and she needed someone there, and I became the overnight child, so I would come down and spend the night with grandmother. Every night I'd come down and spend the night with her. She'd feed me breakfast. I'd come home for scripture reading, and then I'd go back, traversing the same ground, back to Emerson Grade School for school. And I took care of grandmother all the time until I went on my mission. And she was a great influence to me. She was very smart, very capable lady. She went back to college when her husband died, and she was in her 50s. And just like her children, she only got one letter in her grades. Sometimes it would have an A-, but that was rare. So she graduated doing just fine and taught grade school in the grade school next to my junior high school. So Jefferson Grade School was next door to Irving Junior High. And if I was serving lunch, grandmother would come through, and I would feed them, and I would go over and visit with grandmother, and sometimes I'd go tell stories to her class and that kind of stuff. So it was nice. There we go.
There you go.